Next, we have a short talk delivered by Joey from Michael Bronstein's lab from University of Oxford on painless simulation of multiple pre-trained protein generative models through the superposition principle.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me over here. So I'm super excited to talk to you about a very recent paper that was presented last week at iClear as a spotlight on how do you combine pre-trained generative models in a more principled manner. To motivate this a little bit, let's talk about where we are in terms of generative modeling and the sciences more broadly. So far, we've seen tons of generative models. In fact, you could say it's a Cambrian explosion of generative models. And it's not restricted to any particular domain necessarily. For instance, for images, you might have already been familiar with a lot of existing models out there. These frontier models like ImageN, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, they're doing a lot of miraculous things. And just going on from images to video, we've already seen photorealistic videos that you can even use as commercials if you wanted to. So in all of these spaces, there are a bunch of different models that are in some ways experts in variety of different domains. But in the case of life sciences, we've also seen a similar revolution where in proteins we've seen Rosetta fold diffusion, AlphaFold 3 is a generative model as well, and so on and so forth. But because these models are so different and specialist, one natural question arises is, well, how do we get the best of all models in some sense? So more specifically, wouldn't it make a lot more sense to say, can we just train bigger and bigger models? And in some ways, this is a very poisoned question because obviously we can't do this because a lot of the times these models are trained on proprietary data or data sets that we don't have easy access to. So moreover, a lot of these models are also available through only API access, so you don't even have the internals of these models. But at the same time, you kind of want to get the best of all worlds. So in many cases, it's not really easy to just train a bigger and bigger model. So what do we actually do? So let's taking a step back, we can ask the question of, if we were to combine different frontier models, what would that actually look like? So suppose you had models 1, 2, and 3, and up to model n, and each of these models is, in some case, a specialist or an expert in a variety of subdomains. And you could ask the question, what does it mean to actually build a mixture of expert model in the first place? Historically, in machine learning, mixture of expert models have actually been state-of-the-art models. In fact, GPT-4 itself was a mixture of expert model. So in some sense, we do want to build an expert model, but it's unclear how to do this in a more methodologically principled manner. So in this talk, I really want to motivate how do we build or compose models from first principles. So the research question that I kind of want to paint towards is, can we combine pre-trained diffusion models specifically at inference time? And why do we want to maybe combine them at inference time? Inference over here means just simulating using the model. And this has the nice benefit that you don't have to train a model. And this is particularly interesting because it allows you to kind of take existing models out there without necessarily building a new model, but getting the benefits of having a much larger model in the first place. So to give a bit more of a pictorial overview, what could this actually look like? So imagine you have a data set as follows, where you have training data A and training data B in different colors. If you had diffusion models that are trained on each respective data set, you could ask the question, how would we compose them? Naively, you could say, let's just average the outputs of the models. But if you did that, you'd get something in the middle like this, where the orange points over here are generated samples. But these generated samples don't have the benefit of either data set, so you haven't really accomplished a whole lot. Instead, what you could do is maybe you could do a sampling of the mixture of densities. In this case, you would get a model that kind of acts as if it was a mixture of models, so you get samples that are from all the different modes. Intuitively, this is like doing a logical OR operation between models. Alternatively, what you could do is you can also sample from equal densities. That is to say that generating samples that have equal densities under each model. Now, in this case, the different models over here, green and purple, don't have any shared overlap. So an equal density region would be a density of low density region rather. So this is kind of similar to saying this is a logical AND operation. So how do we build these logical OR and AND operations from existing models? So this is going to be the focus of this talk, which is going to be the superposition of diffusion models. And we're going to introduce an algorithm called SuperDiff that allows us to do this. So to understand how to do this from first principles, we need to get a shared understanding of what a diffusion model is. I'm sure many of you in the audience already know this, but it's good to recap a little bit. So a diffusion model, as you may know, takes initial data distribution, P data, and constructs a forward noising process where you take a stochastic differential equation characterized by its drift, which is the average direction you move in, with a little bit of noise, which is the Brownian motion, scaled by a diffusion coefficient. And you propagate this process forward in time until you hit a terminal distribution, which is going to be a standard normal distribution. Now, importantly, this process that I described over here has a very nice time reversal in the sense that you can characterize exactly the reverse process that takes you from this Gaussian distribution back to your data distribution. And in this case, this reverse process is also going to be an SDE. And in particular, the vector field that moves you in this reverse process is given to you in analytic form with this expression over here. So the key quantity of interest over here that diffusion models end up all estimating is this score function, which tells you the direction of higher likelihood the reverse process needs to navigate until you hit the data distribution. And diffusion models typically estimate this score function using a neural network. And they estimate the score function everywhere in space and time. So given a trained diffusion model with access to its score function, how do we kind of build this logical OR operation? So remember, our logical OR operation was essentially getting a mixture of densities. That is to say that you want to essentially combine or compose existing diffusion models such that you have one model that samples from all different modes at inference time. And for the ease of presentation, I'm going to focus on this setting, but similar analogies will extend to the AND setting as well. So the OR setting. I promise this is going to be probably the last slide of complex math, and then we're going to go into a little bit more pictures again. So if you give me a diffusion model, we can look at essentially the time evolution of all the particles. So that's the density. This tells us how the model is changing over time. Now, because this is a stochastic differential equation, this time evolution has to satisfy the Fokker-Planck equation. In particular, the Fokker-Planck equation tells you the first term on the first equation is essentially the continuity equation, which tells you how the drift is changing. Well, the second term is the Laplacian associated with adding the noise. Now, if you had a mixture model, what you really want to say is that Qt, which is the time evolution of the mixture process, how does that evolve over time? Well, it turns out if you have a mixture model, it's also going to be another stochastic differential equation. And in particular, the reverse SDE is going to be characterized by this new UT, where UT is your velocity. So different operations, you can build UT from first principles. So in this case, I'm showing how to build the UT as a combination of different models itself. So the last equation at the bottom tells you the weighted average of the different likelihoods assigned by each diffusion model at everywhere in time tells you a way to move of combining these models. So let's intuit what exactly is happening a bit. So the last equation is essentially different weights that you multiply the vector field that kind of forces you to go in different directions. Now this weights is controlled by each individual diffusion model's own density. So this Qi of t. So if I have m different models, I have m different densities. So this immediately poses a potential problem. The problem is that we need access to this Qi of t, and this Qi of t is the density. Now, naively, this is very difficult to get access to your diffusion model because to get access to the density, you would have to kind of simulate the model in the first place, and that's a very expensive operation. So how do we get these densities for free if you want to build these vector fields? Now, naively, what you would kind of do to build these vector fields and these densities is to kind of integrate the change in density over time. And this change in density is given to you by this term, which is the log density, plus the second term over here, which is how the change happens incrementally as I move along this process. Now, it turns out this change of density, because it satisfies the continuity equation, you can account for it by just taking the time derivative of this log function. So if I remind you, when you take the time derivative of a function of two different variables, time and space, you have to account for how it changes in time, which is the first term over here, and how it changes in position. Now, you can apply this analogy by just differentiating this log density from first principles, and I'll spare the derivation, but what ends up happening is that you get a couple of terms. The first term tells you how the change in time happens, and the last couple of terms tells you how this change in space happens. Now, to give a bit more intuition for what's happening here, this is coming from the celebrated Ito's lemma in stochastic calculus. So in some sense, it's saying, how does a stochastic process, if you take the Taylor approximation for it and apply it to the Taylor approximation to this change of density, how does that actually look like? Now, if you expand and collect these terms, what ends up happening is that you get this very initially complicated looking expression, but it's actually going to be very simple for us. this expression has two different terms. And what you'll notice is that none of these terms have this very complicated divergence operator. So this divergence operator is kind of what you would initially have had to use to compute the change in density. But if you just apply this little bit of this math lemma, you get this essentially for free a way to calculate the change in density. So this is going to be a lot faster for you to compute than any other previous methods of computing density. And what this allows us to kind of do is say, when we simulate each diffusion model at inference, we can automatically get the change in density associated with each model, almost for free. And one of the main results of this paper is this new density estimator, which we call Ito's density estimator. And you'll notice that you can plug in any velocity field in this expression over here and get the equivalent change of density. So what does that actually mean? It means that when we solve the inference problem, we can essentially paint any path for the model to follow, and this tells you the density along this path. So taking a step back, what are the benefits? The benefits of this density estimator is that it's very agnostic. You can apply it for any diffusion model you have, regardless of domain, regardless of architecture. And it can work for any number of models. But there is one point of caution. The point of caution being that because you need to compute the score function, if you don't have access to the learned score, or essentially the ground truth score, you're going to have a biased estimate. But in certain applications, this is not an issue. So to motivate this even more, let's look at some experiments and how you could actually use this new density estimator to build new different composition rules. So let's look at unconditional protein generation for a minute. Now, the question I want to answer with this experiment is to say, I have two different protein generative models that are trained on maybe different data sets and have different architectures. How do I combine them? So if you know anything about protein generative models, one common class of models is protein backbone models, which generates 3D coordinates. So in this case, what you would have is a forward process that takes you from a backbone to pure noise, and the reverse process, which is being learned by the diffusion model, that takes you from noise back to data. Now, two popular model choices historically have been Proteus and FrameDiff, where FrameDiff is a diffusion model that came out of MIT. And you could ask the question, well, these models are trained on different data. Can we get the best of both models? So to evaluate this new inference process of composing models, we're going to look at a couple of in silico metrics, so designability, which tells us how likely the generated structure can refold into another structure, which is based on an off-the-shelf refolding algorithm. Novelty, which tells us how similar the protein sequences are to the training data set. And finally, diversity, which is kind of trying to characterize the generations and how similar they are to each other. So here are the baseline numbers for the models that exist. Now, if you naively average the scores of these models, you get a model that's not particularly good at anything. Now, if you apply these composition rules that I've been building towards, the OR and AND operations, you essentially get models that are going to be slightly more diverse or slightly more designable. And if you play with the hyperparameters a little bit, it turns out you can tweak the designability of these models to a much greater number than either of these models to begin with. And this kind of really highlights one of the benefits of composing models. Almost for free, you get a superior model without actually doing any more training. So here's an example of the UMAP structures of these models. So the green and the orange are the existing models, while the purple ones are the superdiff generated structures only at inference time. You can kind of get a feeling for the fact that the generated structures have more coverage in some sense compared to any individual model. So let's look at another application. Let's look at conditional molecule generation. So suppose you want to do multiple property generation, which is to say that I want a molecule that, let's say, inhibits this enzyme GSK3 beta and has high drug likeness. Now, to do this, we're going to use a pre-trained latent diffusion model called LDMOL, and we're going to prompt it with these following prompts. And then we're going to prompt it in natural language. We're going to say, this molecule inhibits GSK3 beta, and as well, this molecule looks like a drug. And we're going to try to look at the last column over here, which tells us how faithful is the generation to both properties, or the product of properties. Now, if you create a joint prompt, which essentially tells you, let's do property A and property B, you get a model that kind of does a bit of both, but not quite well on either of them. And if you average the scores again, you also get something that's mediocre. However, if you do superdiff AND, you get a model that more readily satisfies both properties simultaneously, again without training. And of course, when you do this, you get molecules that are much more valid and unique as well. So I'm going to end with this final slide over here, which gives you a visual picture of what these models look like, or the generated samples. And the last column over here, you can see the generation has higher property scores than either of the individual composing strategies of joint prompting or averaging the scores. And I'll end here.
Yeah, thank you, Joey.
So if you go back to slide 24,
Oh.
when you separate the time and the space processes,
One second.
I think it was 24. It might have been,
This one? Or
yeah,
probably this one, I believe.
I think it was that one.
Over here?
Yeah, down. Yeah, like, well, when you separate time and the spatial variation, and then, you know, you sort of go forward and reverse these processes, is that an assumption, or is that analytically true for all?
That's analytically true for any diffusion model. The way that this breakdown happens, you have to assume one specific property of your diffusion model, that the drift is going to be affine, which is generally true for all existing diffusion models we use in ML. But if you have a more complicated SD, then this is going to be a more complicated expression.
Right. So, I mean, where do you think that's the model? You formulate the model, you fit things into it, and then that's analytically true, you know, for the optimization side of things. Where do you think that doesn't fit reality most?
Well, where it doesn't fit reality is the fact that, again, what this assumes access to is the gradient of log Q. And this assumes access to the true score. And you will never have the true score. In practice, you'll only have an estimate to the score, which is learned by your model. So you're going to always have a biased estimate of this change of density. And for applications where you really need the exact likelihood, this is going to fail you. But for guiding generation, in this case that I've shown, this is totally okay, even if you have a bias estimate. But if you wanted to do reweighting of samples or correction through reweighting, then this is going to probably fail you.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.